Have you ever wondered what it truly meant to be rich in the Middle Ages? Not merely to own gold, but to command it, to have land so vast that the wind itself seemed to answer to you, to have men who fought and died at the faint wave of your jewelled hand. For most people born into that world, the dream of wealth was a story told by candlelight, something that lived in the songs of minstrels, not in the muddy lanes where they drew their breath. But for a few, wealth was not a dream. It was destiny. It was the invisible crown that marked them as chosen by God himself. Medieval society was a ladder with only 3 rungs: those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. And at the top of all those who fought stood the king, not just a man, but a symbol, the living heartbeat of his realm. Every acre of soil, every harvest, every soldier's breath ultimately belonged to him. The royal estate alone could fill his coffers with an annual income that would drown an ordinary man in luxury. And when that wasn't enough, when wars needed waging or castles needed razing, he simply reached deeper into the pockets of his people, taxing them in the name of divine right and royal necessity. To be a successful conqueror was to be an alchemist of nations. Each captured city was a crucible, melting gold and power together into something eternal. Consider Emperor Basil II of Byzantium, known to history as the Bulgar Slayer, who ruled for 49 long years. His empire shimmered with trade routes that snaked across continents, carrying silk and silver, prayers and power. He was not a man who wasted his fortune on velvet robes or feasts that vanished in the smoke of torches. Instead, he poured his gold into his army, iron in one hand, faith in the other. When Basil finally died in the year 1025, he left behind not just a treasury overflowing with unimaginable riches, but a realm so stable that for decades after his death, not a single invader could shake its peace. Yet even in such magnificence, money was only half the story. To be truly rich in the Middle Ages was to wield influence, to command loyalty, to own men's futures as surely as you owned their land. A lord's worth was not measured only in coin, but in obedience, in the number of knights who would ride when he called, and in the quiet fear that his name inspired. Below the king stretched a chain of noble titles, dukes, earls, and barons, each one shimmering with privilege and peril in equal measure. They were the tenants-in-chief, holding their estates directly from the king himself. But their wealth was never truly their own. It was borrowed power, revocable with a frown from the throne. And yet, for as long as they pleased their monarch, their lives were golden. A single earl in the 14th century could draw an income of several £1,000s a year from his estates, vast manors where peasants bent their backs in exchange for survival. Thomas of Lancaster, for instance, a man whose name still rustles through the dusty corridors of medieval history, held titles like Leicester, Derby, Lincoln, and Salisbury all at once. His income, even by the standards of kings, was staggering, more than £11,000 in the year 1311, equal to more than 6 million today. The closer you stood to the king, the more you glittered in his reflected light. Queen Isabella, wife of the unfortunate Edward II, granted herself 20,000 marks a year, a sum that would turn most nobles pale with envy. Others, like Hugh Despencer the Younger, found favour by loyalty and cunning. He received not only titles but castles, Hanley, Bristol, Wallingford, each one a fortress of stone and pride. Such favouritism was dangerous, though. It bred resentment among barons who saw their king's affection turned into gold for another man. And resentment, in the Middle Ages, often ended in war. By 1326, England's royal treasury held £62,000, a fortune that would amount to nearly 50 million in modern value. But every coin had been bought with someone's blood, someone's rebellion, someone's ruin. To be rich in this world was to stand on the edge of a sword, dazzling but deadly. And then there were the knights, the smaller stars orbiting the noble sun. Around 3,000 of them rode across England in the 14th century, each commanding a modest estate, each drawing about £40 a year, enough to live comfortably, though not extravagantly. For a skilled labourer earning barely 3 shillings a week, even that was a fortune beyond comprehension. But knighthood came with its own temptations for wealth. War, brutal as it was, could be profitable. A victorious knight might capture a noble enemy and ransom him back for gold. Even a minor French soldier could fetch a tidy sum, 60 crowns or so, perhaps £13 in modern value. And if you were lucky enough to catch someone truly important, the reward could be life-changing. When the King of France, Jean II, was captured at Poitiers in 1356, his ransom reached the astronomical sum of 3 million écus. The gold of one man could fund an entire nation's ambition. In such a world, power and wealth were twin flames, feeding one another, consuming all who reached too close. To fight was to gamble your soul for a chance at glory, to serve a king who might one day raise you to riches or bury you under the weight of his wars. And yet, if battle was not for you, if the sword felt too heavy and the blood too real, there was another way to rise. You could always choose to pray. If fighting did not tempt your soul, if your heart trembled at the clash of steel and the smoke of siege engines, there was another path toward fortune, one paved not with blood, but with prayers. To join those who prayed was to enter a quieter kingdom, where power was draped in robes of humility and whispered through candlelight instead of shouted from horseback. But make no mistake, behind the chants, the incense, and the hymns, the church in the Middle Ages was one of the greatest engines of wealth the world had ever seen. By the 14th century, England alone was speckled with sanctity, 1,000 religious houses, each like a tiny world unto itself. There were 200 friaries, 150 nunneries, 700 hospitals, and over 600 monasteries. These were not merely places of devotion, they were empires of quiet industry. The grand abbeys of Glastonbury and Westminster shone brightest among them, each drawing in incomes of more than £2,000 a year. Rivers of silver flowing through cloisters, refectories, and chapter houses. Inside those stone walls the monks prayed, yes, but they also worked and traded and built. They owned land, fields, flocks, and forests. They had their own mills that ground the grain of peasants, their own bakehouses and breweries, where barley turned to beer under the watch of men who sang psalms as they stirred. In an age when most men lived and died poor, monasteries were islands of wealth, golden sanctuaries protected by God's name and man's fear. Across Europe, the church grew not just as a shepherd of souls, but as a master of coin. To be a bishop in the 14th century was to live as richly as an earl. Velvet-lined halls, silver goblets, and servants who bowed as if before royalty. The power of the clergy was subtle but immense. Their land stretched from valley to sea, and their words shaped not only the hearts of men, but the fate of kingdoms. Even a peasant, that most ordinary of creatures bound to the soil, could find a spark of possibility within the church's shadow. A young man, weary of the plough, might find himself at the door of an abbey, humbly begging to join the order. If the abbot approved, his past life melted away with the cutting of his hair. He became a monk, and though his days would be filled with prayer and labour, he might in time rise higher than he ever dreamed. Some, through diligence and divine favour, became abbots themselves, rulers of their monastic realms, their word law within the walls of stone and silence. Still, the great offices of the church, the gilded thrones of bishops, archbishops, and cardinals, were most often filled by the sons of nobility. Faith and bloodline went hand in hand, but sometimes the wheel of fortune spun differently. There were those born of nothing who rose to unimaginable heights, their ambition wrapped in humility, their hunger disguised as holiness. Take John Stafford, for example. Born illegitimate, a child whose birth might have condemned him to obscurity, he ascended the ranks of the church until, in 1443, he became Archbishop of Canterbury, the very heart of English Christianity. Or Thomas Wolsey, the butcher's son, who rose higher still. Made Archbishop of York in 1514, then a cardinal a year later, Wolsey's influence eclipsed nearly every noble in England. When he became Lord Chancellor to King Henry VIII, his wealth and power were beyond measure. At the height of his glory, Wolsey spent 200,000 crowns, the equivalent of £25 million today, on restoring Hampton Court Palace, a monument not only to faith but to ambition dressed in scarlet robes. It was said that when Wolsey walked through the streets, people bowed as they would to the king himself. He had everything, gold, power, reverence, except, perhaps, peace. For in the end, even those who prayed were not free from the storms of pride and politics. The church was a ladder just as steep and treacherous as the battlefield, one where a wrong word or a misplaced favour could bring a man tumbling from glory to disgrace. Still, for many, the path of prayer was safer than the sword. The scent of parchment and tallow candles replaced the smell of blood and horses. The clinking of coins in the offering plate was gentler than the clash of steel, and in a world where the poor toiled under the sun, praying could indeed make you rich, not only in soul, but in silver. Yet there was a third path still, one that belonged to the countless hands who tilled the soil, spun the cloth, built the cities, and carried the weight of every lord and priest upon their backs. The path of those who worked. If the sword was too heavy and the rosary too still, then your fate, like that of most souls born into the Middle Ages, was to work. To till the soil until your hands blistered, to knead bread until your wrists ached, to carry the stones that others would live behind. For most, the world was a small circle of land, a patch of mud and wheat that belonged not to them, but to some distant lord whose name they might never even hear. It was not a cruel world by accident, it was simply built that way. From the moment you were born, your place was known. The son of a peasant would likely die a peasant. A daughter of a baker would knead her days away by the oven's glow. Mobility was rare, like a miracle, a rumour carried by travellers, a story told by candlelight, and yet miracles did happen. There were those who refused to stay where they were planted. A clever craftsman might wander from his village to a nearby town, a place that pulsed with trade, with noise, with opportunity. Cities like Bruges, Paris, Venice, and Hamburg were not just clusters of stone and smoke. They were living things, hungry and restless. Markets spilled into the streets like rivers of colour and sound. Merchants shouted, coins clinked, spices burned in the air, and silk shimmered in the sun. For a young man with steady hands and a quick mind, this chaos was not frightening. It was a doorway. To work for a lord was to live, but to sell something in a city was to live well. A skilled tailor could clothe the wives of merchants. A blacksmith could craft blades for knights or hinges for cathedral doors. A potter could turn earth itself into profit. And those who served, who washed, cooked, and tended to the needs of the wealthy, often earned more than those who sweated in the fields. A good servant, loyal and discreet, could rise in a household, trusted with keys and secrets, and maybe even inherit a sliver of comfort. But it was the merchants, the new men of the medieval world, who truly changed everything. They were not born noble, nor were they ordained by God, yet they began to amass fortunes that rivaled both. In the 12th and 13th centuries, as towns gained charters and independence, the old feudal order began to tremble. No longer bound to the land, people became bound to trade, to ships, to caravans, to the glittering promise of goods moving from one hand to another. From Africa came ivory, gold, and slaves. From the east, silks, spices, and strange powders that smelled of paradise. From Italy came art, glass, and ambition. And with every trade, with every coin that changed hands, value multiplied, invisible wealth blooming like mould across parchment ledgers. If you timed it right, if you knew when the ships would come and where the market would hunger most, you could become rich almost overnight. A fortune made not with swords or blessings, but with ink, wit, and nerve. And then came the next step, the most dangerous kind of wealth, money that made more money. Banking. It began with lending. A merchant might loan coin to a fellow trader, charging a small fee in return. At first, it was practical, a way to grease the wheels of commerce. But soon, it became an art. The Medici family of Florence were among the first to master it. They began humbly, weaving wool and selling cloth. But by 1397 they had founded the Medici Bank, a vast web of gold stretching from Florence to London, Geneva, and Rome. Their influence grew quietly, beautifully, like ivy around the pillars of Europe's palaces. By the 15th century they were the richest family in Europe, and their fortune was so immense that they didn't just lend to kings. They made them. Others followed their path. Francesco d'Attini, born in 1335, started as a poor apprentice, a boy running errands for Florentine traders. Yet by the time he was 40, he had become the merchant's merchant, the symbol of everything possible in a world that swore mobility was impossible. He began as an arms trader in Avignon during the 100 Years' War, selling weapons to princes and mercenaries alike. Later, he sold anything profitable: jewels, spices, wool, grain, even art. When his coffers overflowed, he did what the Medici had done. He opened a bank. Branches bloomed across Europe: Barcelona, Valencia, Pisa, Genoa, until Datini's name was spoken with awe and envy in every counting house. But in the Middle Ages, even wealth had its curse. Gold could be both salvation and noose. The Knights Templar learned this too well. Once a holy order of warrior monks, they became the bankers of Europe, lending to princes and running the royal treasury of France itself. Their ledgers glowed with royal debts, and among them was a name that spelled their doom: King Philip IV. When they refused him entry into their order, and worse, when they demanded payment, the king turned against them. With the Pope's blessing, he accused them of heresy. On a cold dawn in 1307, torches flickered outside Templar commanderies across France. Doors were smashed in, knights were dragged into the streets in chains, and their vaults were emptied in the name of faith. They were tortured, executed and burned, not for their sins, but for their gold. The message was clear. In the Middle Ages, wealth could make you powerful, but never untouchable, and yet some managed the impossible. Far to the south, across the dunes of Africa, another name was whispered, one not of priest or prince, but of a king whose riches defied imagination. Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire in the 14th century, his fortune was woven from gold and salt, the twin treasures of the Sahara. His empire stretched across Senegal, Guinea, and Mauritania, its veins pulsing with caravans heavy with dust and metal. In 1324, on his pilgrimage to Mecca, Musa passed through Cairo. There, he spent so lavishly, giving away gold in such abundance, that the Egyptian economy itself began to tremble. Prices collapsed, markets wavered. His generosity was a storm of wealth that left ripples for years. Historians would later call him the richest man who ever lived. But perhaps what mattered more was what his story symbolized, that even in an age ruled by kings and priests, fortune could still be found by those bold enough to seek it. In the end, whether you prayed, fought, or worked, wealth in the Middle Ages was never just about coins. It was about control, over land, over men, over fate. Gold, after all, was only metal, but power? That was eternal. But what do you do once your coffers are full, when the clinking of gold is no longer a sound of promise, but a burden of temptation? In the Middle Ages, fortune was not a finish line, it was a test, and those who failed it lost everything. To be rich in this world was to walk a narrow bridge between awe and envy. People whispered about you in marketplaces, prayed for your favour in chapels, and secretly wished for your downfall when the candles went out. For gold was never silent. It spoke, loudly, dangerously, especially when kings could hear its voice. By the 13th century, the merchant bankers of Europe had become the quiet power behind crowns. They did not rule through armies or anointed blessings, but through ink and ledgers. Their wealth crossed mountains and oceans in the form of promises, letters of credit, foreign exchange, invisible gold that moved faster than any caravan could ride. And yet, in a world ruled by superstition, such unseen wealth began to feel like sorcery. The Knights Templar knew that feeling well. Their story began with faith, warriors sworn to protect pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. They had taken vows of poverty and obedience, but as crusades raged and empires rose, donations poured in. Every knight who joined their order surrendered his fortune to God, and God, in the form of the Templars, invested it wisely. Soon their fortress monasteries dotted Europe. Their ships carried not only men but treasure, tithes, taxes, and gold belonging to nobles who trusted no one else. The Templars became the bankers of kings, the keepers of the realm's wealth. Even the royal treasury of France was placed under their guard. And then came the debt. the kind of debt no sword could erase. King Philip IV of France owed them more than his crown could cover. When the Templars refused him the honour of joining their order, an insult to his pride, not just his purse, his gratitude turned to hatred. In secret, he conspired with Pope Clement V. At dawn on a Friday in October 1307, the king's men rode out through the streets of Paris and beyond. Torches lit the dawn as armoured fists pounded on Templar gates. Hundreds were dragged from their beds, accused of heresy, witchcraft, blasphemy, anything that could justify their ruin. In cold, dripping dungeons, they were tortured into confession. Their gold was seized for the church, their leaders burned alive, and the rest scattered into history like ash on the wind. The Templars had discovered the most dangerous truth of the Middle Ages, that no one, not even those who served God, could safely be richer than a king. Yet the hunger for wealth never died, it only changed shape. When kings grew cautious of banks, banks learned to disguise themselves. Merchant families hid their fortunes behind guilds, estates, and cathedrals. Some funded wars, others funded the men who wrote history. And far beyond Europe, across deserts that shimmered like molten glass, another man's fortune was rising. One so vast it seemed more legend than fact. Mansa Musa, the Emperor of Mali, whose kingdom stretched across the dunes and rivers of West Africa, where gold was as common as dust. The Sahara was his treasury, the Niger River his trade route. His empire thrived on the lifeblood of commerce, salt from the north, gold from the south, and taxes from everything that passed between. When Mansa Musa set out on his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he did not travel like a man. He moved like a miracle. 60,000 men marched beside him, 12,000 slaves each carrying gold bars, camels draped in silk, horses shod with silver. As he passed through the cities of Africa and Arabia, he gave away gold so freely that it shook the very balance of the world's economy. Cairo itself, proud ancient Cairo, collapsed under the weight of his generosity. Prices fell, coins devalued, and for years after, Egypt's markets whispered his name like a spell. To this day, no one truly knows how much he possessed. Historians call him the richest man who ever lived. But perhaps the true measure of his wealth was not in gold, but in the way his story still glows, centuries later, like sunlight on a river of dust. The Middle Ages may have been ruled by kings and priests, but men like Musa, the Medici, and Datini proved that wealth had a will of its own. It flowed where ambition guided it, and it built its own kind of kingdom, one made not of faith or lineage, but of daring. And yet, for every man who climbed that high, there were 1,000 more who remained at the bottom, looking up at castles they would never enter. Their riches were smaller, quieter, a day's meal, a warm hearth, the laughter of their children before sleep. But in a world as fragile as theirs, even that was a kind of fortune. Still, wealth, true wealth, was never just about money. It was about what survived you. A name, a song, a building that stood when your bones were dust. The Medici left palaces. The kings left wars, the monks left cathedrals, and the peasants, they left the world itself, tilled, fed, and held together by their labour. For gold tarnishes, but legacy, that gleams forever. We like to imagine that wealth brings peace, that once the chest is full, the hunger ends. But in the Middle Ages, gold was never still. It moved from hand to hand like a restless ghost, searching for new masters, new dreams to haunt. For kings, wealth was a weapon, the power to wage wars, to buy loyalty, to reshape nations in their image. For the church, it was proof of divine favour, a glittering mirror that reflected heaven's approval. For merchants, it was freedom, the rarest thing of all. And for the poor, it was myth, a promise that life could be different if only fate had been kinder. But even then, some understood that wealth had its price. Too much of it, and you became its prisoner. Not enough, and you became its servant. Few ever found balance. In Florence, as the Medici counted their florins by candlelight, they also counted their enemies. Every coin minted their power, but also their downfall. In palaces filled with frescoes and silk, they whispered prayers not of gratitude, but of fear. They had everything, and everyone knew it. and in the quiet halls of monasteries, where candles flickered against cold stone, monks who had once vowed poverty found themselves surrounded by gold and grain. Their barns overflowed, their vineyards stretched for miles, their rings gleamed in the sunlight, and they too began to fear. For the world outside was watching. Wealth in the Middle Ages was never safe. It drew the eye of kings, of bishops, of bandits, of fate itself. And so, the poor learned something the rich often forgot, that to have little is to have peace, a loaf of bread, a roof that doesn't leak, a child's laughter that cost nothing. They were poor, yes, but in a strange, quiet way, they were free. Because when night fell over the Middle Ages, over the castles and cathedrals, over the markets and manors, it made no distinction. The same darkness that covered kings also covered peasants, and under the same moon they all dreamed, some of heaven, others of gold. As centuries rolled forward, the balance between wealth and salvation began to blur. Gold and God, two masters, both demanding, both merciless in their own way. In the early cathedrals of Europe, every block of stone was a sermon. Peasants carried limestone and marble up endless scaffolds, lifting heaven with their hands while they themselves slept in the mud. The bells they cast with their sweat would one day toll over their graves. But for every mason who died nameless, a bishop's name was carved in glass, gilded letters immortalized above the altar. Wealth was not only held, it was displayed. To walk through the nave of Chartres or Notre Dame was to enter a treasury disguised as a temple. Candlesticks taller than men, chalices of gold encrusted with gems mined by distant slaves, tapestries woven with silk from Persia, all meant to glorify God, but also, unmistakably, to glorify those who served him. The faithful knelt before relics sealed in jeweled boxes, a splinter of the true cross, a bone of a saint, a vial of holy blood that shimmered red under torchlight. Pilgrims walked hundreds of miles just to glimpse them, and where the pilgrims went, money followed. Inns, merchants, and thieves grew rich in the shadow of holiness. It was said that the road to Santiago de Compostela was paved with faith and silver. Every innkeeper knew how to price a prayer, every monk how to bless a coin, and yet, amid all this sacred commerce, something else began to stir, a quiet, dangerous thought. If wealth was power, and the church had all the wealth, who then held the soul of the world? By the 14th century, murmurs of discontent grew into whispers, and whispers into fire. In the streets of Florence, men in tattered robes preached that salvation could not be bought. In Prague, John Hus declared that faith belonged to all, not just those who could pay for it. He was burned alive for his trouble, his ashes scattered in the wind, but his words, like sparks, refused to die. The peasants listened, the merchants listened, even the monks kneeling in gold-trimmed chapels began to wonder. How much of heaven had already been sold? Still, the machine of medieval wealth kept turning. Across Europe, cities pulsed like new hearts. In Venice, bankers scribbled beneath oil lamps as gondolas slipped through moonlit canals carrying silk, spice, and sin. In London, the guilds rose, blacksmiths, weavers, carpenters, and masons, each guarding their secrets like small kingdoms. To join a guild was to buy safety, to buy dignity, perhaps even a little power. The streets echoed with the rhythm of trade, iron against anvil, coin against counter, prayer against greed. Even the farmers began to dream differently. In the quiet corners of the countryside, they spoke of owning land one day, not for a lord, not for God, but for themselves. They worked the soil and saved what they could, hiding coins in clay jars beneath their hearthstones. Each penny was a small rebellion, a whispered defiance against the centuries of bondage. For the first time, wealth was no longer the language of birth. It could be earned, built, hidden, and that was dangerous. A merchant could now rival a baron. A craftsman could dress better than a knight, and for those at the top, that was a terrifying thought. The church preached humility, the nobles demanded loyalty, but the cities were preaching something new. Ambition. In the candlelit halls of Florence, of Genoa, of Lubeck and Ghent, young men stared at ledgers the way others stared at holy books. They saw patterns in numbers the way monks saw visions in clouds. They understood that gold obeyed only one law: movement. If you could move it faster, farther, more cleverly, you could rule without ever wearing a crown. And so they began to write their own gospels, not of faith, but of finance. Ink replaced blood, and contracts became the new commandments. But still, in the flickering dark of every marketplace, one could sense the danger, the smell of fire, the weight of envy, the rumour that all fortunes, even the most divine, eventually burn. By the late Middle Ages, the old order was beginning to tremble. Kings still ruled, popes still thundered from their gilded thrones, but in the narrow streets of Europe's cities something quieter, and far more dangerous, was growing. The merchant. Once dismissed as mere traders, these men were now the veins through which gold itself flowed. Their ledgers stretched farther than any sword could reach. They spoke the languages of a dozen ports, knew the tides of every sea, and understood a truth that neither crown nor cross had yet grasped: that power did not come from land or armies anymore. It came from exchange. Venice was their temple. Its marble palaces leaned over dark green water like mirrors of heaven and sin. Gondoliers sang through the fog, while behind shuttered windows, bankers and traders whispered in the language of numbers. Ships arrived from Alexandria and Cyprus, their holds swollen with pepper, silk, sugar, and stories. Every crate that thudded onto the docks carried the scent of another world. And in the smoky taverns by the port, sailors told tales that sounded like prophecy, of cities made of gold, of islands that glimmered with pearls, of kings who paid in diamonds. The merchants listened, and they took notes. They began to fund explorers, adventurers, soldiers of fortune, men who would risk their lives for trade routes and spices. The medieval age of commerce was becoming something else entirely, the dawn of capitalism, though no one yet knew its name. In Florence, the Medici family had already mastered this new world. Their money bought art, influence, and eternity. Cosimo de' Medici understood that gold, if used wisely, could sanctify ambition. He loaned vast sums to kings, funded cathedrals, and quietly decided who would wear the papal crown. In a time when popes were chosen by divine will, Cosimo made it clear that divine will could sometimes be negotiated at a reasonable interest rate. The Medici Bank stretched across Europe like a golden spiderweb. London, Geneva, Rome, Avignon, all glittered with their branches. Their agents travelled with armed guards, carrying promissory notes sealed with wax and secrecy. They had invented something no sword could touch: trust. The gold itself rarely moved. The numbers did, and in that invisible motion lay the birth of the modern world. But where there is gold, there is also rot. The Medici's rivals multiplied. Families like the Bardi and the Peruzzi rose and fell like waves. Entire banks collapsed when kings defaulted on their debts. England's Edward III borrowed vast sums to fund his endless wars with France, and when he failed to repay, the great Florentine houses went bankrupt. Thousands lost everything. It was a reminder that even the most beautiful empire could crumble with a single unpaid promise. Still, the merchants rebuilt. They always did. They learned to hide their gold inside partnerships and trusts, to spread risk like butter over too much bread. They bought paintings to launder wealth, jewels to transport it, and favour to protect it. Every cathedral they funded was half prayer, half insurance. And the church, that great eternal banker of souls, began to borrow from them too. Papal indulgences, pilgrim relics, holy relic trades, all were funded by loans and guarantees. The Vatican became both a palace of God and a client of Florence. Faith, once the currency of salvation, had become literal currency. And in the quiet streets of Europe, beneath towers of marble and frescoed ceilings, whispers began to rise that perhaps salvation itself had a price tag, stamped with a banker's seal. Meanwhile, the peasants watched from below. The world was changing too quickly for them to understand, but they felt it in the air. A tension, a hunger, an invisible shifting of power. The merchants rode through their villages dressed in silks, finer than any nobles. They spoke to kings as equals. They built palaces in cities instead of castles in fields. They were rewriting the very story of hierarchy. one coin at a time. And so the Middle Ages, once divided between those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked, began to blur. Now there was a new class, those who traded, and they would not be ignored. By the 15th century, Europe was no longer the quiet continent of castles and cloisters. It had become a living marketplace, a continent humming with movement, greed, and the soft creak of ship masts swaying in salt wind. Gold, silk, slaves, and souls, all were traded, all were priced. Venice and Genoa were its twin hearts. Their ports throbbed with the sound of sailors shouting in a dozen tongues, the smell of tar and citrus and sweat. Ships rolled in from Alexandria, Constantinople, and Tunis, their hulls heavy with cargo that glittered in the lamplight like treasure chests cracked open by destiny. Pepper from India, cloves from Java, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, sugar so fine it melted between one's fingers. In the narrow alleys of Venice, bankers' lamps glowed like stars in the fog. Deals were made in whispers, fortunes written in ink on parchment that smelled faintly of blood and sea brine. And behind every bargain was risk, the kind that could turn a man from pauper to prince before the tide came in, or drag him to ruin before dawn. The sea was both fortune and grave. Many ships never returned, lost to storms, corsairs, or the endless hunger of the ocean. But those that did, those that staggered back to port after months on the waves, unloaded wealth enough to build cathedrals. And for the merchants waiting on the docks, each creaking gangplank was a prayer answered. Trade had become the new crusade. No longer were men crossing seas for the Holy Sepulchre, but for spices, sugar, and silk. The world's sacred relics were no longer bones of saints, but bars of gold and bolts of cloth. Even faith itself began to smell faintly of cinnamon and coin. In Bruges, a new kind of city was born, the market city, the counting house republic. Its canals mirrored the faces of merchants who dressed like princes but prayed like accountants. In the great halls of the Hanseatic League, northern traders carved out their own empires without ever drawing a sword. They ruled not with banners but with ledgers. Their ships, squat strong cogs of oak, sailed from Lubeck to London, from Bergen to Novgorod, laden with wax, wool, fish, and fear. And their power spread quietly, like ink soaking into parchment. But beneath the glitter, there was darkness. Trade was not only movement of goods, it was movement of lives. In the ports of Lisbon, Genoa, and Seville, a new kind of cargo began to appear, people. Men and women taken from Africa's coasts, traded first as servants, then as property. They were measured, inspected, and sold beneath the same sun that gleamed on silver and silk. Their bodies were another form of currency in a world that was learning to value profit over everything else. It was the beginning of something vast and terrible, a shadow that would stretch across centuries, born here in the age of merchants and maps. Still, for those who survived by trade, the world had never felt so alive. Caravans crossed deserts that shimmered like glass. Ships cut through storms that tore sails like parchment. Merchants followed rumours of islands, of golden kingdoms, of unknown gods. They mapped the edges of the earth not for glory, but for gain, and in their pursuit they changed history itself. Every route they opened, every ledger they balanced, every risk they took became a bridge between civilizations, between Europe, Africa, and Asia. The world was no longer divided by faith or distance, but by who could afford the voyage. For the first time in history, the rich did not just rule. They connected. They stitched the continents together with silk and gold thread, weaving a tapestry of profit that glittered like heaven and smelled faintly of death. Back in Europe, the old nobility began to wither. Their swords gathered dust while the merchants' quills scratched new laws onto paper. The barons watched helplessly as the men they once called common bought their castles, married their daughters, and funded their kings. It was as though gold had become a new kind of god, one that required no church, no priest, and no forgiveness. And yet, even this new god was not eternal, because soon across the horizon new powers were stirring. Nations that would sail farther than any merchant dared, with cannons and crosses and flags that bore not saints, but crowns. The Middle Ages were ending, quietly, like a candle that had burned too long, and from its wax and smoke the modern world was being born. When the Middle Ages began to fade, they did not fall into silence. They melted, slowly, richly, like wax under a sun of gold. The clang of swords gave way to the soft scratch of quills, and the roar of crusades turned into the murmur of workshops where men in linen aprons painted eternity with oil and pigment. The merchant had become a patron, the banker a philosopher, the city a cathedral of commerce and art. Florence stood at the centre of it all, a city built not on conquest, but on calculation. Its streets hummed with the sound of chisels and bells, of hammers on marble and whispers about credit. Gold flowed like blood through its veins, and every brick of its churches seemed to pulse with invisible wealth. The Medici, those merchants of destiny, no longer hid behind their ledgers. They stood in frescoes beside saints, their faces immortalized in paint. They funded architects like Brunelleschi, who lifted domes into the heavens as if defying gravity itself, and painters like Botticelli, whose angels glowed with the same luminous warmth as Florentine sunsets. Wealth had found a new disguise, beauty. The same coins that once bought armies now purchased marble and colour. The same hands that signed contracts now blessed artists. Art became the new expression of power, and patrons sought not just profit, but posterity. For the first time in centuries, gold began to serve imagination. It gilded the halos of the Virgin, the armour of saints, the arches of palaces. Every chapel fresco, every marble statue was a prayer written in colour and a confession in disguise. Because even in this rebirth, greed did not die. It simply learned to smile. The Medici bankrolled popes and sculptors alike. They funded science as they had once funded faith. Their coins built cathedrals, but also bought silence. Behind the glitter of the Renaissance, power was still traded in shadows, in papal offices, in bankers' parlours, in the soft rustle of velvet curtains. And yet, something truly miraculous was happening. For centuries, Europe's wealth had been hoarded, locked in vaults, buried beneath castles, hoisted in the treasuries of kings. Now it was being spent, transformed, poured into the minds and hands of dreamers who could shape it into light. The Renaissance was, in truth, the most expensive idea ever invented. It cost fortunes, generations, and faith itself. But it gave birth to something gold could never buy: curiosity. Merchants began to fund astronomers, philosophers, and scholars. They wanted maps that showed not just trade routes, but the shape of the heavens. They wanted beauty that outlasted silk, truth that outshone gems. And for the first time, humanity began to look not only upward toward God, but inward toward itself. Still, in the glow of this new age, the shadow of the old one lingered. The poor remained, the hungry remained. The monks still prayed. But now they prayed under ceilings painted with the hands of men who had once sold wool, iron, or spice. Even the church, which had once condemned the sin of usury, quietly took loans from the very bankers it had damned. Gold had won, and in its victory it had remade the world. But what no one could yet see was that the same hunger that built Florence would soon consume entire continents. The maps on the merchant's desk, those fragile parchments inked with guesses and rumours, were about to open like wings, and through them a new flood of fortune, conquest, and catastrophe would pour into the world, because the age of trade was not ending. It was only about to get bigger. It began with a map, a parchment stretched across a merchant's desk, edges curling like the lips of an old secret. On it, the known world, Europe, Asia, Africa, all drawn with patient ink and trembling imagination. Beyond its borders, only darkness and monsters, sea serpents and the words, "Here be dragons." For centuries, those words had kept men home. But by the end of the 15th century, the merchants and monarchs of Europe had begun to wonder, what if the dragons were guarding gold? The age of discovery was not born from courage, it was born from hunger. The same hunger that drove peasants to sow the fields, monks to fill the coffers, and merchants to chase the scent of pepper and silk. Gold had given Europe wealth. Now it demanded the world. In Lisbon and Seville, The harbours sang with the sound of ropes, gulls, and ambition. Sailors kissed their families goodbye and vanished into the horizon on ships that looked too fragile to outlive the tide. They were chasing a rumour that somewhere beyond the edge of the known world, new lands waited, heavy with spice, silver, and salvation. Portugal led the way. Prince Henry the Navigator, a man who never sailed far himself, funded those who did. His caravels slipped down the coast of Africa, hugging its shape like fingertips tracing a treasure map. They traded copper, ivory, and salt, and slowly, quietly began to trade people. In 1492, the tide turned forever. A Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, funded by Spanish monarchs and the promise of profit, crossed an ocean no one yet understood. He carried no map for what he would find, only letters of credit and a mind sharpened by desperation. When his ships reached the Caribbean, the first thing they saw were not monsters, but palms, green, glittering, silent, and in that silence history broke. For centuries Europe had looked inward, toward its kings, its cathedrals, its wars. Now it turned outward toward the unknown, and what it found there was not paradise, but possession. The New World became a mirror of Europe's oldest desire: wealth. Gold dust from the rivers of the Americas, silver from Potosi, sugar from the Caribbean, all began to pour back across the Atlantic like the return of a long-forgotten debt. The same merchants who once counted coins beneath the arches of Florence now counted empires. Every voyage was a gamble, every discovery a theft. The ships that sailed for faith and glory returned heavy with greed, and behind them followed new kinds of merchants, conquistadors, priests, colonizers, each believing they were chosen by destiny, when in truth they were servants of the same old god, gold. The spice that once perfumed Venice now passed through Lisbon. The silks of Cathay came by cape routes guarded by cannon and cross. The world had become a single market, and Europe its master. But there was a cost. In the jungles and deserts of the conquered world, millions were enslaved, displaced, erased. Entire civilizations, the Aztec, the Inca, the Taino, fell beneath the boots of men who saw in them not souls, but silver. The hunger that had built cathedrals now devoured continents. And yet, to the merchants and monarchs back home, it seemed as though heaven itself had opened. Gold flooded into Europe, glittering across crowns, chalices, and mirrors. Nobles wore gemstones that once belonged to kings of forgotten lands. Cities grew taller, richer, louder, the hum of trade louder than the toll of any church bell. But with each ship that docked, Europe changed. It grew restless, uneasy, addicted to expansion. The medieval world, once bounded by stone and scripture, was dissolving into oceans of possibility, and in that vast, glittering horizon a new truth began to form, that greed was no longer sin. It was progress. For a time, Europe seemed drunk on its own triumph. The gold that poured from the New World shimmered through every palace and pulpit. The coins that clinked in the hands of kings came from rivers that once ran red with conquest. And yet, for all its gleam, something dark was spreading through the heart of this new golden age, a sickness that glittered. Gold had always promised power, but now it began to rot it. The more Europe gained, the more it wanted, and the faster it consumed itself. In Spain, the ships from the Indies arrived heavy with treasure, silver so pure it could blind the eye. But the treasure that made Spain rich also made it weak. Prices rose like fever. Bread cost more, wages less. Farmers abandoned their fields to dream of gold, merchants hoarded silver that lost value by the day. It was the first great inflation, a silent storm that turned wealth into shadow. The streets of Seville swelled with beggars clutching coins that could no longer buy food. Nobles who once dined on imported sugar now starved in palaces filled with useless silver. Even kings felt it, their treasuries overflowing yet empty in truth. For what good is gold when everyone has it and no one can eat it? The curse of abundance had begun. Across the continent, other powers watched and learned. England turned its eyes to trade, building ships instead of cathedrals. Holland learned to count not in gold but in shares. inventing companies where risk could be sold like silk. And in the quiet counting houses of Amsterdam, a new idea began to take shape, that money itself could be made from belief. Paper replaced silver. Promise replaced possession. Wealth became air, invisible, infinite, intoxicating. But the roots of the Middle Ages still clung to this new world. Greed wore a new face, but the hunger behind it was ancient. Merchants built mansions beside monasteries. Bankers prayed in chapels whose altars they had funded. The church, which had once forbidden lending for interest, now borrowed freely, blessing the very sins it once condemned. It was as though the world had been reversed. Heaven below, hell above, and all of it paid for in coin. In Florence, the Medici rose to power not through swords, but through numbers. Their ledgers decided who would be crowned pope, who would marry, who would be remembered. Their money built domes that scraped the sky, but it also built prisons, both visible and unseen. For every masterpiece that bloomed under their patronage, there was a debtor ruined, a rival erased, a price paid quietly in the dark. The more beautiful Europe became, the more it trembled. Art and plague, cathedrals and corruption, invention and famine, all danced together under the same gilded sun. The Renaissance had revealed humanity's brilliance, but it had also exposed its thirst. And as the 16th century bled into the 17th, the curse of wealth began to show its full form. Nations turned against each other, not for faith, but for fortune. The wars of religion were wars of taxation in disguise. Armies paid for by merchants, generals bought by bankers. The same coins that funded Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel also bought muskets and mercenaries that tore Europe apart. The dream of gold that had started in the Middle Ages had finally come true. Everyone wanted to be rich, and no one could afford it. In candlelit parlours, philosophers began to write about the nature of wealth, how it shaped men, how it unmade them. Some whispered that gold was not a blessing, but a test. Others said it was a mirror that showed what the soul truly was, and when they looked into it, they saw not heaven, but themselves. Proud, frightened, hungry. The peasants still worked, the monks still prayed, the kings still fought. But the merchants, the quiet architects of all this glory and ruin, began to sense that their age was ending too. Their sons no longer counted ships or sacks of spice, but empires. They did not dream of trade, they dreamed of conquest. And in those dreams, the modern world, our world, was waiting, patient and smiling. By the 17th century, the dream that began in the Middle Ages had grown teeth. The hunger for gold had become the hunger for growth. Every coin wanted to become two. Every voyage wanted to become an empire. Every idea, a commodity. The old words, faith, honour, duty, still hung in the air like faded banners, but beneath them the world had changed. Trade was no longer a craft, it was an engine, and the men who once sold spices and silks now sold the future itself. In Amsterdam, the first stock exchange opened, a quiet building filled with the hum of speculation. Men in dark coats traded shares of companies that owned lands they would never see, ships they would never sail. The Dutch East India Company became a kingdom without borders, its fleet larger than most nations' navies, its profits carved from the sweat of unseen millions. The age of merchants had given birth to something new, capitalism, and with it came a new kind of faith, not in God, but in credit. The power to promise, to predict, to profit. Money had become a story everyone agreed to believe, and the more they believed, the more real it became. The same Europe that once worshipped relics and saints now worshipped numbers. A ledger could raise an army, a signature could topple a crown. And in candlelit counting rooms, beneath the ticking of new mechanical clocks, the rhythm of the world began to change, faster, steadier, endless. The medieval dream of gold had at last transformed into something vast and invisible. Not coins, not jewels, not land, but motion. The constant turning of value, chasing itself forever. And as the merchants became bankers, and the bankers became nations, one truth remained. That everything built on wealth eventually turns to dust. But even dust under the right light can glitter. Centuries passed and the world forgot where it began. The kings who waged wars for silver, The monks who prayed for tithe, the peasants who dreamed of a single gold coin, they were gone, their names worn smooth by time. But the world they built still whispered beneath our feet. Every city skyline, every factory, every market is an echo of that medieval hunger, the desire to turn survival into surplus and surplus into power. The same fire that melted ore into coins now powers engines and screens. The same greed that built cathedrals still builds corporations. The same prayers, only quieter, still rise, not to God, but to the invisible altar of profit. And yet, as it was then, so it remains now. For every man who gains the world, another loses it. For every fortune that rises, a silence falls somewhere else. Maybe that was the secret the Middle Ages tried to teach us, hidden beneath the armour and the incense and the gold leaf. That wealth is never truly owned. It passes through hands like water, blessing some, drowning others. And when it's gone, what's left behind is not what we kept, but what we built. Because the richest men of the Middle Ages are dust now. Their castles have crumbled, their ledgers turned to ash, but the bridges they funded, the cities they raised, the art they inspired, those still stand. And in the quiet light of history, that is a kind of immortality money could never buy. So if you listen, really listen, you can still hear it. The faint clink of a medieval coin, the sigh of a merchant closing his ledger, the echo of a world learning, for the first time, what it meant to be rich. And in the end, it was never about gold, it was about time, how we spent it, how we sold it, how we lost it. The Middle Ages merely showed us the beginning. The rest of the story we're still writing. And now, the candles burn low, the merchants are gone, their ledgers closed, their ships long turned to ghosts beneath the waves. The kings are dust, the priests forgotten, the peasants asleep beneath the very fields they once tilled. Only the gold remains, buried deep, quiet, patient. It does not sing, it does not shine. It waits, as it always has, for the next dreamer to find it and believe it means something more. We tell ourselves that we are wiser now, that our coins and screens and systems are different, but the same ancient hunger still hums beneath our pulse. The wish to have more, to hold more, to rise higher, to fill the silence with the sound of something earned. But maybe, if we listen closely enough, we'll hear what the Middle Ages already knew, that gold cannot buy peace, that power cannot buy rest, and that all wealth eventually ends the same way, in stillness. The richest man in a kingdom dies as quietly as the poorest. The crown and the plough rust in the same rain, and the world goes on, green again, forgiving, alive. So tonight, let the clink of coins fade. Let the wars of greed and glory dissolve into the dark. And imagine the sound of a medieval marketplace falling into sleep. The voices softening, the horses stilled, the last lamp flickering against stone walls warm with twilight. Because even in that world of hunger and gold, there were moments, rare, tender, eternal, when someone looked up from their work or their prayer or their counting and simply listened to the wind, and in that breath, that pause, that silence, they were, for just a heartbeat, rich beyond measure. Sleep well, traveller of time. The gold is gone, but the story remains.